We've talked about the 5 steps to data strategy excellence, with the first step being that of awareness and raising the consciousness within the company for why a business outcome data strategy is important, and giving you quite a lot of material to start that discussion if you are that data strategy champion. The next section is how you would actually run a defined session workshop, and all of the steps and deliverables that you would want to go through within that stage, within that workshop. Now, I'm not going to cover every single item in detail, but I will give you enough so that you can get a sense of how you would actually run that workshop, what are the deliverables, how do you prepare for that, and how do you lead a conversation. You know, my advice to you is that these workshops may take a couple of days, or it may take longer, depending on how many outcomes you come up with. But they're very good in starting to get that mindset around business outcome and data strategy alignment. So now you've got your prioritized outcomes. Now you have your material business processes. You've identified the data topics that are going to matter most. Now comes identifying what about that data has to be managed, or what I call the data strategy requirements. We provided a guide in your workbook to help you through identifying what are the questions that you're going to have to ask about that data that has to change. But let me give you some of the examples. So in the guide, first item is about reporting and analytics. And here what that means is, for that outcome within that process, what's the key analytics and reporting that you're going to have to need? Because understanding what that is will then help you understand, well, what data has to be managed within that analytic, for that analytic to be effective. Data acquisition. This is often not addressed in a data strategy, but especially if you're entering a new market or a new country, you won't have the data that you need in order to be able to give the business what it needs for its customers and maybe its competition. So you're going to have to actually buy some data externally. That's a data acquisition strategy subcomponent that you're going to identify. Where are you going to buy this data from? What are going to be the terms and conditions? Where is this data going to reside? Who's going to buy this data? Who's going to maintain it? Those are the key elements that you need to address about data acquisition. Of course, there's going to be data quality, right? Data quality in terms of, is the data that you currently have to support the process good enough? Do you know what is the data quality criteria? Will there need to be further enrichment? Do you have to supplement some data going back to the acquisition to meet the quality requirements that the process is going to need? That should all be addressed in that section of the data strategy. Data ethics. Again, data ethics and other compliance, maybe to security and privacy, those are also elements of your data strategy that you should investigate. Data ethics is particularly important and more emerging as the role that a chief data officer is going to have to lead for the company. And what does data ethics mean, especially in the context of people data? What are going to be the parameters by which data ethics will be evaluated in your company? Do you need some data ethics policies because you're going to be doing some new AI or predictive scenarios, or some automation where some profiling may be done, and you want to make sure there's some guardrails around the decisions that are made within those scenarios? Those are some of the topics around data ethics that you're going to have to address. Not necessarily in detail for the data strategy, but calling it out specifically in the document so that the company executives understand that that's going to be a critical, non-technical capability that you're going to have to investigate as part of the strategy. The organization, right? often, again, overlooked in the data strategy, but now you have everything that you need in order to make a recommendation on what's the right organization to put in place. You know, oftentimes we like to first put an organization in place and say, this is the organization that we need, and then you try to sell that to your company that you need a data, you know, that you need a chief data officer, and you need all these data leaders, and you need the business to do X, Y, and Z for data. And it kind of falls on deaf ears because they don't have the context. But once you've now shown them clearly that this outcome requires this process and this data has to be managed to these elements, then it's going to naturally fall out that you're going to need an organizational structure to make this all happen. And exactly what data leaders are you going to need for what kind of data, and what the role of that chief data officer is going to be. That should also be included in your data strategy. And then the metrics. How are you going to measure the success of this program, the return on investments, the delivery of the business outcomes, the enablement, the cost? All of those dimensions should also be part of your data strategy. So take a look at that data strategy guide that's in your workbook. It'll help you also to ask the right questions during your workshop about what needs to be managed for that data. Putting the right organizational structure in place is such an important component of your data strategy that we've got a whole section in the Masterclass series devoted to that. So join in for that session. But now what I want to talk about is how you bring all of this material that you've just completed in your workshop together on the data strategy canvas. Now let me tell you why I like the data strategy canvas. Obviously it's not a detailed data strategy document. You're going to need that anyway, and you want to have a document that you can provide to your stakeholders. The canvas is another way to communicate your overall direction in one slide, and that's what I like about it, making it crisp, identifying sort of the key messages within your strategy. So if you look at the data strategy canvas, you're going to have a place to identify the key business strategy, the goals, and the outcomes at a high level. You'll identify the short-term priorities. You'll identify the data processes at a high level, again, level 1 and level 2. You're going to describe the measures of success. You're going to put together some high-level data strategy requirements, whether it's going to be the acquisition, whether it's going to be data quality, whether there's going to be data ethics, you know, some of those key high-level requirements. You're going to be you'll identify that critical data within the master data, within the transactional, the reference, the ones that are most important, but you'll identify that subset clearly. And then you'll also describe at a high level the accountability model, right? Will you need a head of data? Will you need data leaders for certain topics, whether that's for master data, for your customer data, for your other data, right? Make it that accountability clear, the role of the business, the role of IT, again, at a very high level. And then you have a place to identify your risk, right? High-level risk, whether those are technical risk, operational risk, or some data quality risk. So a great snapshot that you can use to document, that you can hang on the wall, because, you know, as we talked about, being able to communicate effectively your data strategy is an important success criteria. So take a look at the data strategy canvas that's in your material and see if you can fill this out with what you already know. Let's spend a few minutes on the kinds of data strategy risks that you want to identify in your canvas. So as I said, there's kind of 3 major categories. You've got technology risk. Example of that would be there's some new innovation that's going to be required on the data side, or some certainly new data types for the innovation, like AI and machine learning. So you'll want to identify whether to achieve that data strategy, you're going to have to take some risk on the technology side, and what the level of maturity, technical maturity could be of all the solutions that you're proposing in your strategy. I think that's very important to spell out. You've got some operational risk, right? What are the risks in your data strategy? Well, one could be that you don't have the right skills in place. Maybe you're going to need some data scientists in the organization and you don't have that. Maybe you're going to need a better process definition than what you currently have. You might want to identify the culture in your company as a potential operational risk, especially if managing data is something new to the organization, and there's all sorts of maturity assessments, which we've talked about in the previous sessions, and benchmarking that you can use to validate that. And then the last category is really data quality risk. So as much as you know today, and possibly by doing some profiling of the data quality that's going to be required for those processes, do you know already that you're going to have some serious data quality gaps in certain areas? The more that you can articulate that and put that on the data strategy canvas and also document that well, because that's going to require some probably resources and some remediation during the project, and you want to make that very clear in your project plans and in your strategy documents.